As you may have noticed, our Vuex files have become quite large. This is a sign that it is time to split up the store into modules. As you may know, Vuex allows us to divide our store into modules, where each module can contain its own state, mutations, actions, getters, and even nested modules. Modularizing the whole store can be a long and tiresome process that sometimes is necessary. I highly recommend that you used namespace modules from the early stages of your application if there's a chance for your application to grow. Let's get started by creating a directory under the store to put our modules in. To begin with, I will create a module for the threads. I will name this file threads.js. Modules just export an object with their state, getters, actions, and so on. When we work with modules, we have two states. We have the global root state that is defined in the index file. And we also have a separate local state, one for each module. Vuex modules receive their local state as the first argument in the mutations and getters, where you normally see the root state come in. Right now, the root state includes the threads property that should be moved to the threads module's local state. Even though this is valid, in order to access the threads outside of the module, we will need to go to state.threads to access the module, and then .threads to get to the threads inside of its state. Because this looks a little weird, I like to name this property items. Other common conventions are all or cached. Feel free to use whichever one you like the best. So, from now on, we will access the threads outside of the module under state.threads.items. Cool. Let's move on to the getters. In the getters file, there is a thread getter that should go into the threads module. Since we renamed the threads property to items in the module's local state, here we should use items in order to access the specified thread. Also, we need access to the findById helper function, so let's import it now. Next up, let's see which actions are related to the threads. The createThread action definitely belongs to the threads module. Once I move it, VS Code complains because we have to import the Firebase library. The next action we should move is update thread. Now, VS Code is complaining that the doc2resource function is undefined. Let's import it. Lastly, we have the fetch actions to fetch one or multiple resources. Some people prefer to name the module actions fetch item and fetch items accordingly, but I prefer to specify the resource in the action name so that I can find them easily. And that's it for the actions. Lastly, we have to move the thread-related mutations. The only mutations we have about threads are related to multiple resources. For instance, append post to thread has to do with both a thread and a post. The assets, like mutations and actions, that interact with multiple resources should be registered globally, so perhaps we can leave these here. Though this is actually not the case for these mutations. If we take a closer look, we can see that the append child to parent mutation only updates the parent. So, append post to thread will update only a thread, and thus we should move it to the threads module. Now we don't have access to the make append child to parent mutation function, since it's declared in the mutations file. Since we will need this function in multiple modules, I will extract it to the helper file. I will also change the syntax to use the arrow syntax to be consistent with the other exported helper functions. If you remember, the only reason we used the traditional function declaration syntax was to take advantage of hoisting, but that's no longer necessary. Back to our module, we can now import the helper function. Next, we have the append contributor to thread that appends a user ID to a thread. So this one belongs in the threads module as well. At this point, it's fairly easy to spot these mutations that belong to the threads by checking the parent option. With that, append thread to forum would go in the forums module, and append thread to user in the users module. Okay, so now we have all the mutations that update the thread state living in the threads module. Since we renamed the threads property to items, we now have to update all the instances of state.threads to state.items. Remember that here the state is the local module state, so it includes only the items property. The mutations we have here are created by our helper function, so we will have to update this function as well to take into account .items. We will do that after we split the whole store into modules. Alright, now I'm going to do the same thing I did for threads to each of the other resources, that is, posts, forums, categories, and users. I won't make you watch that though. You can find all the code changes in the lesson's source code. Alright, I have created a module for each of the resources and did the same work we did for the threads. Even though authentication is not a resource like threads or posts, it's still handy to have the whole logic inside of a module. Let's do that together. I will create a new module. For the auth module, we don't have items in the state like we do with the other resources, but we do have some auth related state that we're keeping up with. We have auth ID, auth user unsubscribe, and the auth observer unsubscribe. Let's move those over into the module. Next, we have the auth user getter. Then, in the actions file, we have a bunch of actions related to authentication. Let's also import Firebase here. Lastly, we have three mutations that deal with auth. Sweet, we have managed to split the store into our modules. The rest of the mutations and actions should stay global, since they are used in multiple modules and don't relate to any one multiple resource. Lastly, let's import all the modules into the store index file and register them in the modules option. We still have some ways to go yet before our forum starts working again, but we'll work on that more in the next lesson. In the last lesson, we began the process of migrating our Vuex store to modules. Let's continue doing that in this video. I'd like to use namespaces in all of our modules so that actions, mutations, and getters inside of the modules are not registered under the global namespace. The benefit of this is that you can't accidentally commit a mutation, dispatch an action, or get a getter from a different module, and you don't have to worry about naming collisions. Making those connections across modules will take some extra, intentional effort. To namespace a module, we have to set the namespace property to true. Let's do that in all of the modules. Alright, it's time to start refactoring our module's code. I will start with the thread module. Inside of our thread getter, we access the users in the state. However, since we're now in a namespaced module, there is no state.users. The only state that exists in this module is items. So, instead of looking in the thread state for the users, we need to look in the state of the users module. We can do this by accessing the root state and looking for the items in the users module. Root state is available as a third argument on our getter. And then we need to look in the root state under the user's namespace for its items. Cool. Now we need to do something similar for the actions that we dispatch and the mutations that we commit inside the modules. Let's start with the committed mutations. In all cases where we call commit, if the mutation doesn't exist inside of the current module, we need to call it with its namespace prefix and provide a root argument as the third option. So, on the set item mutation, we need to add root true as the third argument. And since the set item mutation is in the global namespace, we don't have to prefix it with anything. For append thread to user and append thread to forum, we also need to add the root true option. But this time, we also need to prefix the mutation names with the appropriate module namespace. Let's do the same thing for the remaining commits. Great, that takes care of the committed mutations. Now we can do similar for the actions that are dispatched. Create post is in the posts module, so it should be prefixed with posts slash. And we need to provide root true. Fetch item and fetch items are both defined in the global namespace, so they just need root true. Cool. I think that should do it for the threads module. Let's move on now to the auth module. In the auth user getter, we are accessing a user getter. Since the getters inside of namespace modules will only give us local getters, we need to change this. Just like there is a root state, there is also a root getters. And it is available via a fourth argument on the getter. Unlike root state, however, we don't use a dot to separate the module from the state. Instead, we use this slash syntax in order to look in the module and then in the getter. Now, let's do the same thing for the commits and dispatches that we did in threads. The set auth observer unsubscribe mutation is defined in the current module, so we can leave it as is. So is the auth ID mutation, so it's good as it is. And this one's still good. Same namespace. This one's good. Alright. Set item is in the global namespace, so we don't need the namespace prefix, but we do need to specify root true. And lastly, this one's still in the same namespace, so it's good. Now, let's look for the instances of dispatch. No change here, as this one's local. Same here. Create user, however, is defined in the user module. So let's namespace it and pass it root true. And again. And fetch item just needs to have root true, as it's in the global namespace. Alright, that brings us back to our first one. So nice. I think we're done with the auth module. Let's move on now to categories. Here, we dispatch the fetch item and fetch items actions. These actions are global and do not belong to any module, so they just need the root true option. In this action, we commit the set item mutation, which is also global, so we will pass the root true option. Now, before we move to the next module, let's take some time to update the global mutations and helpers, starting with the set item mutation. Here, we upsert a document to the list of resources. That list of resources once existed directly on the state, but now it exists as items in the state of each individual module. Cool, easy enough. Next, we have the make append child to parent mutation in the helper file. Here, the returned function will be a mutation inside of a module. So, the state argument will be the module's local state. Therefore, we don't need to know the parent. We can just directly access the items. Good. Next up, we have the forms module. Here, we have just two actions that both dispatch a global action. So, we have to pass root true, and we're good to go. Next up, the posts module. In this module, we have some work to do. Starting with the create post action, we commit a couple of mutations that do not belong in the posts module. The global set item mutation needs root. Then the append posts a thread belongs to the threads module and needs root. This mutation also belongs to the threads module. Finally, we commit set item one more time in the update post method. Let's mark that one with root true. For dispatching, we only call two global actions. So once again, we'll provide root true. We also access state.authID several times throughout this module. We'll have to change that to root state.auth.authID. For actions, we can access the root state via the context parameter. We also need the root state in the update post action. Phew, okay, only one module left, the users module. We call commit twice in this file. Both commit the set item mutation, so we need to pass root true. Dispatch is called twice, once for fetch item and once for fetch items. Let's add root true to both of these. Lastly, inside of the user getter, we look for the posts and the threads related to the user in the state. Let's switch those to root state and get the items from the proper module. Alright, folks, with that, we have managed to split our store into namespaced modules. It was quite a ride, but really it wasn't that difficult. There was a pattern to follow, even though it took some time. I don't know what we might have missed, but we will find out in the next lesson, where we'll go over the components and update the way we interact with the store. After modularizing the store, we have to update all the references in our application and in the components. Before we start updating the page components, let's update the global files like the router file, the navbar, and app.view. Here in the router file, we dispatch the fetch thread action. So we need to provide the namespace. Since we're not inside of a Vuex module, we don't need to provide the root true option because we're already in the global namespace. We also look at the threads in the state. Let's look for those under .items. In the before enter navigation guard on the sign out route, we dispatch the sign out action. This exists inside of the auth module. Lastly, in the global navigation guard, we dispatch two actions. One is under the auth namespace. The next unsubscribe all snapshots action is global. So it's good. We should also modify how we're accessing the auth ID here. We'll look for it under the auth module. Same thing for this line. Great, that should do it for the router file. Now let's go to the navbar. In the navbar, we use the auth user getter to access a namespace getter using map getters. One option is to pass the namespace right before the getter's name. We also dispatch an action to sign the user out. So let's pass the namespace here as well. Okay, now in app.view, we map the fetch auth user action. Just like the auth user getter a second ago, we can provide the namespace as the first argument to the map actions function. Okay, I think we're good with these global files. Let's jump into the home page. If we visit it in the browser, we get some hints on what we have to fix. The first error is unknown action type, unsubscribe auth user snapshot. Let's make sure the call to that is namespaced. It also seems we have to do the same for fetch auth user. That removes those errors. Next, fetch all categories is having issues. Let's namespace that in the homepage component. One option to map namespaced actions is to pass the namespace right before the array with the actions, as we did in app.view. Since the array here includes two actions that belong to different modules, we can call map actions one time for the categories module and then one for the forums. We also access the categories from the state in a computed property of this component. After modularizing the store, state.categories contains the whole state of the categories module. So, to get the actual categories, we have to reference the items property. Let's check back in the browser. This $store.state.forums.filter is not a function. This comes from the category list component. Let's add the necessary .items here. Nice, we've made some progress. We can now see the full home page. Let's check the category page. Unknown action type, fetch category. Let's mount the namespaced actions on the category page. Since we are here, let's also update the category computed property. And we also access the state down on line 36. Let's nest down into items once again. Great, we've got the category page back as well as the home page. Now let's proceed to a forum page. Unknown action type, fetch forum. We know how to fix that by now. Notice how we benefit from using the Vuex helpers, and we don't have to look for and update the actions in multiple places in each component. Let's also fix the computed properties here. We could map this getter to access it via the namespace, like we did for the actions, but since it's not already mapped, let's just access it directly here. We just look under the namespace, like so. Let's see where that gets us. Resources.find is not a function. This is in threadlist.view. Let's go check that out. There are two computed properties here that rely on the store that need to be updated. And with that, the forum page is fixed. Let's go now to the thread page. Here we see unknown action type, fetch thread. Let's go ahead and fix that, as well as the other issues we know that are going to pop up. We'll namespace the getter, and the computed properties will add .items to each of those. Nothing new here. And namespace this getter. Also, under the methods, we're mapping those actions. Before we go to the browser, let's check the post list and post editor component, as they are used on this page. In this file, we have a few instances of the $store variable. Let's resolve those. We also have one action. Nice. Let's check the post editor component. It already looks good. We shouldn't have to make any changes here. All right, let's check it out in the browser. Awesome. Everything is working. Let's also try to create and edit a post. Sweet. Everything's working. Looking good. Let's move now to the thread edit page. We'll take care of the usual changes. Now, if I go to a thread that I created and click on Edit Thread, whoop, we still have one more issue in threads.js. It says it's on line 65. Yeah, that's because this post here needs to be found not from state.post, but from root state.posts. All right, let's try again. Whoop, we still got an issue. Oh, of course, this should be .items. And third time's a charm. Awesome, that worked. We're getting close. Let's tackle thread create. I will do the usual changes here. This needs .items. Our actions need to be namespaced. Alright, let's give it a try. Whoops, there's some kind of error going on there. Let's check the create thread action. Ah, yes, right here we're still looking for the auth ID under the state. Let's change that to look under the root state and then the auth module. There we go. Even though this refactor is quite tiresome, I'm sure you've noticed that the changes are really kind of easy to spot and implement since we have a well structured component system. If we had used namespace modules from the beginning, though, we'd have done ourselves a big favor. Okay, we're getting so close to finishing. Let's check the profile page and do the refactor. We'll namespace the getter and the dispatch of our action. Here, we also have to update the user profile card editor. It dispatches the update user action that needs to be namespaced. Cool. Lastly, let's update the auth related pages. This needs namespaced, as does this, and same thing in register.view. Great. I will sign out, create a new account, then sign out, and try to log in again. Awesome. The whole auth process works fine. I think that does it for refactoring the Vuex store into modules.